Sarah Cole was having the kind of morning that makes a person question every decision that led them to this particular point in their life. She moved through the sleek corridors of Smith Enterprises at a pace that was technically walking, but wanted very much to be running, clutching her bag and tablet against her chest with the grip of someone who suspects they are about to lose everything and would prefer not to lose those things as well. 5 minutes. She had 5 minutes before the meeting where she was supposed to demonstrate that hiring her as an interpreter had been a sound professional decision, and she was already proving the opposite simply by not knowing where the meeting room was. Great start, Sarah, she muttered under her breath, navigating a corner with the confidence of someone who has absolutely no idea where they're going. Fired before the contract is even signed. New personal record. And then, because the morning had not yet reached its full potential for disaster, her stomach made a decision of its own. The need was immediate, urgent, and entirely non-negotiable. She spotted a sign with a small figure on it and experienced approximately 2 seconds of pure relief before she pushed the door open and went in. She washed her hands at the sink, exhaled, and began to notice, in the unhurried way of someone whose crisis had temporarily resolved, that something was not quite right about this bathroom. There were no makeup mirrors. There were no dispensers of the kind one typically found in the women's room. And there were, unmistakably, men's voices coming from somewhere nearby. "Man, that financial report was a disaster," one voice was saying. "And the boss. Have you ever seen anything like that?" Sarah froze. She looked around with the slow, dawning comprehension of someone watching a terrible realization arrive in stages. No. She blinked 3 times. No, absolutely not. She had walked into the men's bathroom. The options available to her in this moment were limited, and none of them were good. She chose the one that felt most survivable and stepped into the nearest stall, pulling the door closed behind her, pressing her back against it, and concentrating on the specific sound of the voices near the sinks moving toward the door, and then, blessedly, out of it. Okay, Sarah, they're gone. You can leave now. No one will ever know this happened. You will simply exit this stall and walk out and never speak of this to anyone for the remainder of your natural life. It was a good plan. It would have been an excellent plan if she had remembered to lock the door. The handle turned. The stall swung open. A tall man in a towel appeared before her with the expression of someone whose morning has just taken a turn they were not prepared for. For approximately half a second, they stared at each other. Then he shouted. Then Sarah shouted. "Why are you screaming?" She yelled, grabbing the toilet paper roll from the holder with the instinct of someone who has decided that a cardboard cylinder is better than nothing. "Why are you in here?" He shot back, in the voice of someone who is trying to determine whether this is real. Sarah's brain, which had been running at emergency capacity, had just enough processing power left to register 3 things in rapid succession: the defined lines of his abdomen, the towel, and the fact that she was staring. She looked away with a velocity that nearly gave her whiplash. "I didn't see anything," she announced, covering her eyes for good measure. "I didn't see anything at all." "Yes, you did," he said, adjusting the towel with the dignified desperation of a man whose dignity is hanging by a very thin thread. Sarah, backing away from the confrontation in what she intended to be a controlled retreat, stepped on the mat and went down. The man closed his eyes. He pressed his lips together. He appeared to be conducting an internal conversation with whatever higher power he held responsible for the current state of his life. "Tell me," he said, with great patience, "that I am going to wake up from this." Sarah, on the floor of a stall in the men's bathroom, staring up at the ceiling tiles, said the first thing that came to mind. "I'm from the sanitary safety audit." She sat up, gaining momentum. "It's a new program. Very innovative. First company to test it, actually. I was just checking whether the facilities meet international standards, and they do. Everything's excellent, so if you'll just let me." She tried to stand and exit simultaneously and achieved neither cleanly, catching her elbow on the stall door in the process. He looked at her the way people look at things they cannot categorize. "A sanitary safety audit in the men's restroom. It's very thorough. Is this a hidden camera situation?" He looked around, apparently genuinely checking. "No." Sarah pulled herself upright with the remaining shreds of her composure. I just walked through the wrong door, and I need to leave now, please. He sighed with the quality of a man who has made peace with something. Get out. Sarah moved, caught her foot on the janitor's cart that had been waiting just outside the stall with the patience of an ambushed predator, and watched in something close to slow motion as a bucket of water described a brief but decisive arc through the air and emptied itself across a considerable portion of the floor. He jumped back. The water reached his feet anyway. She looked at the water. She looked at him. She looked at the water again. Get out. The previous patience in his voice had been entirely consumed. Yes, sir, said Sarah, and ran. She was still running. Internally, when she arrived at the meeting room 30 seconds later, straightened her jacket outside the door, arranged her expression into something she hoped read as professional competence rather than a person who had just evacuated a men's bathroom while knocking over a bucket of water, and walked in. The room was full of executives, board members, and foreign investors arranged around a long conference table. At the head of it stood the tall man in the towel. Except now, he was in a suit. The very fine suit of someone who was, she now understood with a specific sick feeling of recognition, significantly more than a random person she had encountered in a bathroom. His name was on the building. She had walked past it 4 times this morning while lost. William Smith, CEO of Smith Enterprises, stopped walking when he saw her. The room, which had been murmuring with pre-meeting energy, went very quiet. "What are you doing here?" he said. The words arrived with a flatness that suggested he had a strong suspicion he wasn't going to like the answer. Sarah swallowed. Her smile arrived a little late, but it arrived. "Well, Mr. Smith, I'm your new interpreter." The silence that followed had both quantity and quality. Several executives exchanged looks. One of them developed a sudden interest in the documents in front of him. William closed his eyes. He drew a breath, so patient it required visible effort. "I'm being punished," he said quietly, to no one in particular, "for something I did in a previous life." He sat down. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Sarah with the expression of a man who has decided that if the universe is going to do this to him, the least he can do is maintain his professionalism. "Since we're all here," he said, "let's begin." He looked directly at her. "Miss Cole, translate what I just said. Now." Sarah blinked. Oh, so that was how this was going to go. She took a breath, turned to the investors, and translated his words in clean, fluent, impeccably accented language. The investors nodded. Several looked surprised by the quality of it. William didn't look surprised. He looked like he was searching for something to object to and failing to find it, which made him look slightly irritated instead. "This one," he said, and gave her another phrase. Then another, and another. Each one slightly more complex than the last. Each one delivered with the air of someone presenting an obstacle course. Sarah cleared each one. By the end of the meeting, the investors were satisfied, the executives were impressed, and William was standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city with the expression of a man making calculations. "1 week," he said, when the room had cleared. Sarah looked at him. "I'm sorry." He turned around. "You have 1 week to prove you belong in this job. One mistake. That's all it takes." She studied him. "So what you're saying is that if I survive a week, you can't dismiss me." "If you survive," he repeated, which she noted was not quite the same thing as what she'd said. Sarah crossed her arms. "So it's a challenge. Call it whatever helps you." She held his gaze. "Then consider it accepted." He gave her one last long look, the kind calibrated to suggest that he found her confidence misplaced, and walked out. Sarah collapsed into the nearest chair the moment the door closed. 1 week, she said to the empty room. She stared at the ceiling. She sat up. She was not going to lose this job. And if William Smith thought she was the kind of person who folded under pressure, he was about to discover otherwise. The week that followed was a sustained and reasonably sophisticated attempt by William Smith to make Sarah Cole fail at her job, and it didn't work. He gave her complex translations with unreasonable timelines. She met them. He assigned her dense technical documents in languages that required specialized vocabulary. She produced clean, accurate renderings of all of them. He scheduled meetings with 30 minutes' notice. She showed up prepared. What frustrated him most, Sarah suspected, was that she did all of this without losing her sense of humor. One morning, he dropped a report onto her desk that was thick enough to be used as a doorstop. "I need this translated in 2 hours." She looked at the document. She looked at him. 2 hours. She tilted her head. "I'm just wondering if you have a normal relationship with time, or if you experience it differently than the rest of us." He raised an eyebrow. "I heard that. You were supposed to." She was already picking up the document. He narrowed his eyes. "Good. Then stop talking and start." She finished in 1 hour and 53 minutes and placed the completed translation on his desk with the specific satisfaction of someone who has made a point without saying a word. He read through it carefully. Then, "Acceptable." Sarah looked at him. "Acceptable?" "Yes." "Is that William Smith for excellent and better than you expected?" He closed the folder. "Start on the next assignment." She walked out smiling. By the 4th day, she was running on significantly less sleep than was medically advisable. And when he asked her a question during an afternoon briefing, she answered in German without registering the switch. He looked at her. She looked at him. She paused. "Did I just answer that in German?" "Yes." "Oh, a beat. Well, you should learn German. It's a beautiful language." He put his head in his hands in a way that suggested she was testing the structural limits of his patience. On the final day of the week, she walked into his office to receive whatever verdict he had prepared. He was standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, which she was beginning to understand was his position for important pronouncements. "Sit down." She sat. He turned. "You passed." She nearly choked. "What?" He sighed in the way of someone making a confession they prefer not to make. "You're better than I expected." "I'll admit that." Sarah stared at him. Was that a compliment? Did William Smith just give me a compliment? Don't get used to it. She stood, gathering her things, and couldn't entirely contain the smile. "The impossible CEO just admitted he needs me. I'm going to need to document this moment." He narrowed his eyes. "Don't walk into any more men's bathrooms." "I'll do my best," she said and walked out. Behind her, she missed the small, involuntary movement at the corner of his mouth that suggested he was, despite his very best efforts, slightly amused. Sarah had begun to map the territory of working with William Smith, which was less like navigating a professional relationship and more like learning the geography of a country that changed its borders without announcement. He was demanding in the specific way of perfectionists, not arbitrarily, but with the conviction that standards existed for reasons and that lowering them was a form of disrespect to the work itself. He was precise, methodical, and constitutionally incapable of delegating anything he didn't fully trust, which meant he trusted very little and worked constantly. He also, she was discovering, had an extremely low tolerance for people who talked to her in a way he didn't approve of. On a Tuesday afternoon, he appeared at her desk and dropped a document in front of her. "I need this translated." She looked up. "How much time?" He crossed his arms and tilted his head. "Now." She drew a slow breath. "Just wondering if anyone has ever had a conversation with you about the concept of reasonable lead time." He raised an eyebrow. "I heard that. It wasn't under my breath." "Good. Then stop making observations and start working." She gathered the document with a composure she was moderately proud of and went to the conference room, where she spent 2 hours translating as though her continued employment depended on it, which it technically did. When she handed it back, he reviewed it with the focused attention he gave everything. Then he closed the folder. "It's acceptable." She had decided that acceptable, in his vocabulary, was the approximate equivalent of extraordinary in anyone else's. The incident at the board meeting happened the following week. A group of international investors was present, and one of them, while discussing figures, stated an investment value of $20 million when the correct number was $200 million. The error was clear. The implications were significant. Sarah looked at William, waiting to see if he would correct it. He said nothing. He was watching her. She understood in that moment the test, not of her language skills, but of her judgment. She corrected the figure calmly and precisely, in a way that attributed the discrepancy to a numerical misunderstanding rather than incompetence on anyone's part. The investor nodded, recalibrated, and the meeting continued without incident. Afterward, when the room had cleared and she was gathering her notes, William spoke from across the table. "You caught that quickly." She didn't look up. "It was a significant discrepancy." You had the confidence to correct it without being asked. It was going to cause problems if left uncorrected. A pause. She glanced up. His expression was one she hadn't seen before. Measured, assessing, with something underneath it that wasn't exactly warmth but was in the same general neighborhood. Good work. Sarah set down her pen and looked at him directly. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? He raised an eyebrow. What? Did you just say good work? As in, a genuine professional compliment? He picked up his own papers. Don't make it strange. I'm not making it strange, she said. I'm documenting a historical event. He gave her a look that communicated, with efficiency, that he found her exhausting and was walking away. But she thought, watching him go, that the line of his shoulders was marginally less rigid than usual. Something she was beginning to suspect was shifting. She wasn't entirely sure what it was, and she was even less sure what to do about it. The gala was the kind of event that William clearly attended often and enjoyed approximately never. Sarah had been instructed to be present in case translation was needed for the international business partners who would be attending, which was a reasonable professional request. What was less reasonable was the expression on his face when he arrived. He was late, which was unusual enough to note. He was pale, which she had not previously seen. And when a waiter crossed his path with a tray of champagne, William moved away from it with a sharpness that was out of proportion to the encounter. William. She stepped toward him. He walked past her without responding, moving through the crowd with the directness of someone who has identified an exit and is heading for it. She watched him push through the glass doors to the terrace and stand there with his hands on the railing, his back to the party, looking out at the city lights below. She hesitated. The professional response was to let him have his moment and return to the event. She went out anyway. Are you all right? It's not your concern. He didn't turn around. You don't look all right. I need a minute. What happened? Nothing happened. Silence. And then, with the quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is for one moment too tired to carry it. I hate champagne. Sarah looked at him. Any particular reason? He turned his head, and she saw it. A crack in the surface, something underneath it that was undefended and a little lost. Yes, he said. He didn't offer more. She could have nodded and gone back inside. Some part of her professional judgment suggested that was exactly what she should do. Do you want to talk about it? She said instead. He produced a short, humorless sound. Do I look like someone who talks about feelings? Honestly? No. But I think someone probably should have tried before now. He looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a thing they don't have a category for. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss it with something sharp and walk back inside. Instead, he turned away and was quiet, and his hands tightened on the railing until his knuckles whitened. A long time ago, he said, into the night rather than to her. I used to like champagne. She waited. Then I noticed it was always present at the moments when things went wrong. He was quiet for a moment. The night I lost someone I loved. There was champagne. Every time my life turned a corner I hadn't planned for, I was in a room like this one, holding a glass I hadn't asked for. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She said nothing because some things require silence rather than response. You lost someone important, she said softly after a while. He turned to look at her. The quality of his gaze had changed. The usual control was still there but thinned like ice in the first week of spring. Yes. I'm sorry. He looked away. It was a long time ago. It doesn't matter. It does, she said. He frowned slightly. What happened to you, William? It matters. He closed his eyes for a second, and she watched him reach for the familiar armor and find it, for once, slightly out of reach. I don't talk about it. I noticed. He laughed, short and without warmth. Sarah looked at him and felt something she could not name precisely, but recognized as important. If you ever want to, she said, I know how to listen. She didn't know why she offered it. Maybe because it seemed like no one had offered it to him before, or at least not without wanting something in return. He was quiet for a long time, looking at her with the careful attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. Then he looked away. Let's go back. She nodded and walked beside him toward the ballroom doors. Just before he stepped back inside, he paused. He glanced at her over his shoulder. Thank you, he said, at a volume that barely carried. Sarah nodded again, watching him step back into the light and noise of the event, his professional composure reassembling itself around him like a suit of armor that fit from long practice. She stood on the terrace for another moment. Something had happened. She wasn't entirely sure what. She was even less sure what to do about it, which was becoming a recurring theme where William Smith was concerned, and she suspected that was itself a kind of answer, even if she wasn't ready to look at it directly. She went back inside. In the days following the gala, William was more withdrawn than usual, which was saying something. He maintained their professional interactions with a precision that was clearly intentional, structured, formal, leaving no space for anything that wasn't strictly about the work. He avoided meeting her eyes and ended conversations slightly before they naturally concluded. Sarah watched this happen and recognized it for what it was. He was building a wall around that moment on the terrace, sealing it over as though proper construction techniques could make it as though it had never occurred. She let him build for a few days. Then a business trip came up. The conference was international and significant, and as his interpreter, she was required to attend. She packed with the resigned efficiency of someone who knows the next several days are going to be complicated and has made peace with that. The flight was long. William spent it reviewing documents on his tablet and declining all attempts at conversation with the particular courtesy of someone who is being polite while being absolutely clear that polite is the ceiling. She read her own materials and did not push. The hotel was extraordinary in the way that hotels are extraordinary when no one is paying for them personally. Sarah collected her key and was orienting herself toward the elevator when his voice came from behind her. "Dinner at 8. Don't be late." She turned. He was already moving toward the lift. "Something appropriate," she called after him. "What does that mean?" "It means dress like someone who represents a company." He stepped into the elevator. She looked at the closed doors for a moment. "Dress like someone who represents a company," she repeated to the lobby and went upstairs. The dinner was formal and carefully orchestrated. William moved through it with the ease of someone who has attended hundreds of events like this and has long since stopped being present at them in any meaningful sense. He said the right things at the right moments, smiled at appropriate intervals, and gave no indication that anything except business occupied his thoughts. Sarah translated and observed and managed the social dynamics with the practiced fluency that had earned her the job, and by the time the evening ended, she was genuinely tired. They rode the elevator up together in the quiet that had become their particular mode of coexistence, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of itself, carrying something neither of them was naming. "I never thought I'd say this," Sarah said, as the doors closed, "but your social version is considerably more alarming than the office version. At least in the office I know what to expect." He glanced at her. "And I never imagined I'd say this, but you talk too much." She opened her mouth to respond. The elevator stopped. Not the normal, arrived at your floor kind of stop. The other kind. The kind accompanied by a small jolt and the absence of any movement that would suggest the situation was resolving itself. Sarah looked at the panel. She looked at William. She waited for him to say something reassuring. He pressed several buttons. Nothing happened. "We're stuck," he said. "What?" He said it again, without apparent distress, which suggested either that he had excellent emotional regulation or that the implications hadn't fully arrived yet. "Looks like we're stuck." Sarah felt the walls of the elevator become approximately 40% closer than they had been. "We are in a metal box," she said carefully, suspended at an unknown height above the ground, in a foreign city. "And your response is looks like we're stuck." He picked up the emergency phone. The conversation was brief. He hung up and turned to face her. "About an hour." Sarah looked at the ceiling. She looked at the floor. She looked at the space that was, she was now acutely aware, quite small. "I need you to know," she said, "that if I die in here, I want it on record that I found this job through legitimate professional channels and did not anticipate that it would end like this. You're not going to die. You don't know that. Sarah, the elevator isn't airtight. You are in absolutely no danger of suffocating." She was pacing, which the elevator made difficult but not quite impossible. "I knew something was going to go wrong on this trip. My instincts said, don't go, and I went anyway, and now I'm going to be found in approximately 1 hour by a maintenance person with my control freak boss, and I would like the universe to please explain what I did to deserve this." William watched her pace with the expression of a man who has decided to let a storm run its course rather than argue with it. "You never show emotions," she said, stopping. "It's bizarre. The one time I saw something like a real feeling from you was on that balcony, and you shut it down within about 90 seconds. He narrowed his eyes, preparing what she suspected was going to be a measured and deflecting response, and then the floor tilted very slightly as she lost her balance. It happened quickly. She stumbled, and before she'd processed the stumble, his hand was around her arm, and she was steadied against him, and the elevator felt considerably smaller than it had a moment ago. She looked up. He looked down. There was a moment, the specific kind of moment that cannot be uncreated once it has happened, that changes the topography of what came before it by simply existing, in which neither of them said anything and neither of them moved, and the thing that had been moving between them for weeks was suddenly entirely visible and entirely present. She saw it arrive in his expression. She watched him register it. She watched him understand, with the specific look of someone who is surprised to discover they feel something they had decided not to feel, that he wanted this just as much as she did. Then the elevator began to move. Sarah stepped back. William adjusted his jacket. He looked at the doors. She looked at her hands. When the doors opened, they walked in opposite directions down the corridor without discussion, and she went into her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about the way he had looked at her and the warmth of his hand and the fact that a stopped elevator had just told her something she wasn't ready to know. The morning produced its expected awkwardness. Sarah arrived at the conference with the intention of being entirely professional and was immediately confronted with William, who was already at the conference table reviewing materials and not looking at her. "Good morning," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided to be normal. "Good morning," he replied, in the tone of someone who has reached the same decision through considerable effort. "After everything that happened, that's all you're going to give me." He looked up. "I'm working. You're avoiding. I'm choosing to focus on what matters." Sarah pressed her lips together. "Right? Of course." Very mature. He went back to his materials. She spent the morning translating with the professionalism she was being paid for and the internal state of someone sorting through an extremely complicated feeling, and by the afternoon, she was tired of both. That evening, when the team was invited to a corporate dinner she would have preferred to skip, she ended up sitting next to William at a long table with the specific misfortune of proximity, without privacy. She had decided to relax into the evening when one of the investors, a man named Thomas Bradford, began paying her the kind of attention that she recognized and did not welcome. It started as pleasant enough conversation and escalated. Through degrees, she noticed clearly even as she fielded each one with professional courtesy. "She's with someone." Sarah went still. William had said it without lifting his eyes from his wine glass, in the tone of a person passing along factual information. Thomas looked at him. "With someone?" William finally looked up. His eyes were unhurried and entirely without warmth. "Yes." Thomas looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who isn't entirely convinced. "Funny, she didn't seem to know that." "She does now," said William. The table was quiet for a moment. Thomas chuckled, reassembled his charm, and tried once more. "Well, if you ever change your mind." "She won't," William said, and the way he said it closed the subject in a way that was quiet and absolute and left no room for further discussion. Thomas raised his hands and returned to his food. The conversation moved on. Sarah sat with the strange sensation of being simultaneously furious and something else she would need more time to categorize. When the dinner ended, William left without waiting for the table to fully disperse. Sarah followed him into the hotel garden with the decisive energy of someone who has been waiting to have a conversation. "What was that?" she said. He turned, hands in his pockets. A problem being resolved before it developed. A problem. She stepped closer. "What exactly do you think I am, that you can just—" He wasn't looking at you correctly. "That's not your decision to." "I didn't like it," he said, and his voice had changed. The control quality was still there, but the thing underneath, it was visible now, and it was honest and undefended and a little raw. "I didn't like the way he was looking at you." Sarah stopped. "You throw me off balance." He said it like a confession, like something he'd been trying not to say and had run out of the capacity to keep inside. And I don't know what to do with that. I haven't known what to do with it since you fell on the floor of a bathroom stall and tried to convince me you were a sanitary inspector. She stared at him. He stepped forward and cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a long kiss, but it was real, the way very few things are real, full of something that had been building for weeks and had finally stopped allowing itself to be managed. When he pulled back, Sarah stood looking at him with her pulse in her ears. He exhaled. Forget it. I shouldn't have done that. Sarah touched her lips. What do you mean, forget it? He looked away. It was a mistake. You kissed me, and you're calling it a mistake. He straightened his jacket with the specific care of someone buying time. I shouldn't have. We were together. She crossed her arms. Those are two entirely different statements, William. He said nothing. She studied him. You felt something. That wasn't nothing, and you know it. He pressed his lips together. And now you're going to walk away and pretend it didn't happen, because that's what you do. She said it without cruelty, but clearly. Every time something real appears, you turn around and leave. William was silent. Then he turned and walked toward the hotel. Sarah stood in the garden in the dark and felt a complicated mixture of frustration and the unmistakable, inconvenient fact that she wanted him to come back and kiss her again, which was, she recognized, a significant problem. She spent the night not sleeping and arrived at the following morning's meetings wearing the specific expression of someone who has decided to be entirely professional and is committing to this by sheer effort of will. When she walked into the conference room, William was already there, and he greeted her with a neutral good morning that could have been addressed to any of the other people in the room. So that was how they were doing this. Fine. She matched his neutrality and raised it slightly, and the morning proceeded with the precise, airless quality of two people giving a very competent performance. The day after that, Olivia, a colleague, suggested dinner at a restaurant downtown, and Sarah agreed with the enthusiasm of someone who needs to be somewhere that isn't this. You've been strange, Olivia said, over wine, in the way of a person who has been waiting to raise this for some time. Just work things. Work things named William Smith? Sarah nearly inhaled her drink. He's my boss. I know. Olivia was unimpressed by this deflection. The whole company has noticed that something is happening. The way he used to look at you. He doesn't look at me at all. Exactly, said Olivia. He never looks at anyone. But he used to look at you. Now he's trying not to, and the trying is extremely obvious. Sarah shook her head. There's nothing happening. Olivia raised her wine glass in the gesture of someone who has made her point and is content to let it stand. Sarah was opening her mouth to say something when she heard her name. She turned. William Smith was standing in the restaurant, dressed in the suit he'd worn all day, with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is in the process of executing. Olivia looked at him, then at Sarah, then at the ceiling. I'll get another glass, she said, and removed herself with impressive efficiency. Now, Sarah said. Now, he confirmed, and she followed him to a quieter section of the restaurant where they could talk without providing entertainment for a full dining room. She crossed her arms and waited. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was preparing to say something he hadn't said before. Then, you were right. She blinked. About? About the kiss. About how I feel. Her heart rate made an unauthorized adjustment. About how you feel, she repeated. He nodded once and looked at her directly. But I don't know what to do with it. Then stop running from it. The answer is that simple. He was still for a moment. Then he stepped forward and pulled her close and kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no immediate retraction, nothing held back. It was the kiss of someone who has decided to stop managing a feeling and simply have it. When they separated, Sarah was smiling. That, she said, is considerably more coherent. He let out a short, genuine laugh that surprised both of them. I'm not good at this. I noticed. She tilted her head. But that's all right. We can work on it. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to identify as his version of warmth. Still reserved, still controlled, but real. Can we start over? We're past starting over, she said. But we can go forward properly. He nodded slowly. Yes, let's do that. And something settled between them. Not neatly, because nothing between them was neat, but genuinely in the way of things that have been true for a while finally being admitted. The morning after brought its own variety of adjustment. Sarah arrived at the office and was met by the specific quality of attention that means people have noticed something but haven't yet decided how to process it. She gathered her materials, made her coffee, and headed to the first meeting with the professional composure of someone who has made her peace with the fact that her life is going to be somewhat discussed for the next week or two. William arrived at the meeting with a neutral expression he applied to all professional situations, said good morning to the room, and took his seat. He did not treat Sarah differently than anyone else in the room. He also did not look at Gregory Shaw, a senior investor with a reputation she had heard referenced in several lowered voice conversations, when Shaw smiled at her across the table with a warmth that exceeded the professional. "Miss Cole," Shaw said, leaning forward slightly, "I've been thinking about an event I'm organizing for international partners. Someone with your particular set of skills and your way of managing people would be enormously valuable. Would you be interested in discussing it?" William's jaw moved. Sarah looked at him briefly, then back at Shaw. "What kind of event are you envisioning?" Shaw elaborated, and as he did, the subtext of his invitation became progressively clearer. "Miss Cole's commitments to the company make her unavailable for outside work," Williams said, in the voice he used for closing discussions. Shaw raised an eyebrow. "I was under the impression she could make that determination herself." The silence was short and unambiguous. "Mr. Shaw," Sarah said, "I appreciate the thought, but I'm currently focused on internal projects. I hope you find someone well-suited to the event." Shaw assessed her for a moment and gave a slight nod. "A shame." After the meeting, she went directly to William's office and closed the door. He looked up. "You want to tell me," she said, "what your problem was in there?" He sighed in the way of someone who does not consider this a problem. Shaw has a history with women in the company. He doesn't mean well. So you were preventing something that didn't need to happen. Sarah looked at him. "And what is it exactly that you feel for me?" He held her gaze, opened his mouth, and then his assistant knocked and entered with an envelope. There was an apology in William's expression that he wouldn't fully show. "Mr. Smith, this was delivered addressed to you personally." She read the name on the envelope and hesitated. "It's for an event in honor of Emily Carter." The air in the room changed. Sarah watched William's face do something she'd never seen it do before. The control was still there, but cracked very slightly at the foundation. He took the envelope. "Thank you, Olivia." Olivia left. The door closed. Sarah watched him hold the envelope with both hands, the paper pressed flat between his fingers. "Who is Emily?" she asked quietly. William stood, walked to the window. "My fiancée." "Your ex-fiancée." His voice was very even, very controlled, in the way of things that have been contained through significant practice. "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. "She died." The words arrived in the room with the weight they deserved. "Oh, William," she said. He raised one hand, a gesture that was not dismissal, but something more like self-protection. "Just give me a moment. Please." She nodded, took her things, walked out. But as she closed the door, she stood on the other side of it for a moment, because her heart had stayed in the room. In the days that followed, William withdrew in the way of someone who knows they have shown too much and is trying to recover the ground. He was professional, clipped, efficient. He ended conversations slightly before they reached anything personal. He occupied the same building as Sarah, but managed to be consistently elsewhere in all the ways that mattered. She let it run for a while. Then, one evening, the light in his office was on after everyone else had gone, and she went in without knocking. He looked up from his desk. "Sarah, I really don't." "I know." She sat down across from him without being invited to. "You need time. You always need time, and then you take it, and then you build a wall, and we go backwards." She looked at him steadily. "So I'm just going to say this, and you can do whatever you want with it. I can't imagine what it was like to lose her. I'm not going to pretend I can. But wanting to be here isn't a betrayal of her, and closing off every person who tries to get close to you isn't protection. It's just loss compounded." He watched her. The control was mostly intact, but the edges of it were tired. "I know," he said, finally. He set down the pen he'd been holding. She was Emily was the only person I'd ever fully trusted. When she died, it felt like the evidence that getting close to anyone is eventually going to cost more than you can afford to pay. And so you decided not to get close to anyone. Yes. Sarah leaned forward. And how's that working out for you? Something shifted in his face, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Not well, he admitted. She held out her hands across the desk. He looked at them for a moment. Then he reached across and took them, and his grip was firm and a little desperate, and she held on. I'm scared, he said. The words came out with the quality of something that has been locked up for a long time and is finally being released into air. So am I, she said. Most things worth doing are frightening. He looked at her for a long moment. Then very slowly, something in his face relaxed. All right, he said, but it was not small. It was a door opening. The morning after, Sarah arrived at work to find the usual William, contained, professional, slightly ahead of everyone else in terms of how many things he had already thought about. But there was something different in the greeting he gave her. It was only a word, and it was the same word he used every morning, but it had a quality it hadn't carried before. They were finding their way towards something. It was slow, and it was cautious, and it was marked with occasional retreats, but it was real. And then Sarah's body produced some information she hadn't anticipated. She spent several mornings dismissing it. The tiredness, she told herself, was the workload. The dizziness was insufficient sleep. The nausea was the restaurant on the corner that she had perhaps been ordering from too frequently. She made these arguments to herself with the conviction of someone who is correctly identifying symptoms and deliberately misattributing them. Until one morning when the nausea was not dismissible, and she sat on the edge of the bathtub in her apartment and looked at the calendar on her phone and counted, and the numbers arranged themselves into an argument she could not counter. She put on sunglasses, which helped nothing, and went to the pharmacy. The clerk was young and cheerful and said pregnancy test at a volume that reached, Sarah estimated, approximately the rear third of the store. Whatever is fastest, Sarah said, at a significantly lower volume. Back in her bathroom, she followed the instructions. She set the test on the counter. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the wall. She looked at her hands. She did not look at the test for the longest 3 minutes of her life. Then she looked at the test. 2 lines. Sarah sat down on the bathroom floor with her back against the cabinet, because the floor seemed like the appropriate response to this development. Oh, she said to the tiles. She was pregnant. The morning passed. She sat with it through the afternoon. She went to a doctor that confirmed what the test had said, and she sat in the waiting room afterwards staring at a plant and thinking about William, about who he was becoming, about the fact that she was carrying his child and he did not yet know, and about what he would say when he did. She arrived at his apartment that evening having rehearsed approximately 7 different approaches to the conversation and having decided that all of them were inadequate. He greeted her at the door, took her coat, and immediately read her face. What happened? She sat down on the couch, and he sat across from her, and she looked at him and said it plainly, because there was no clever approach to this, and simple was the only honest option. I am pregnant. He went very still. It was a different kind of still from his professional stillness. This was the stillness of someone for whom time has briefly stopped while the implications of sentence arrive and organize themselves. Yes. About 6 weeks, the doctor said. William. She watched him. Her own pulse was loud in her ears. And then his expression changed. He laughed. It was not the short, controlled sound she occasionally heard from him. It was unguarded and warm and full of something she had never heard in it before, and he covered his face with both hands for a moment before lowering them, and his eyes were bright. We're going to have a baby. I know. She was watching him carefully. Are you? He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, and she felt the steadiness of him, the realness of him. I never imagined, he said, into her hair, but it's the best thing I've heard in a very long time. She pulled back far enough to see his face. You're not afraid? Yes. He was honest about it. But I'm also happy. He said it like someone discovering a thing and naming it in the same moment. Really, genuinely happy. She felt the tears arrive before she decided to cry. Me too. He cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with a direct, unguarded attention she'd seen from him only a handful of times. "Marry me." She blinked. "What? Marry me?" "Not because of the baby, though that matters, and I want to be there for every single moment of it, but because I want you in my life. I want to build something with you. Properly, without running away." "William." He held her gaze. "I'm ready for this. I know what I'm asking and I know what it means, and I'm ready." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Ask me again when you've proven it." He nodded. He understood what she was saying. Fair enough. And she could see in his face that he was going to. In the weeks that followed, William proved it methodically and without announcement. In the small accumulations, they're the actual substance of a life shared with someone. He came to every doctor's appointment and stood at the ultrasound screen with the expression of a man looking at something that has rearranged his sense of what is important. He rearranged his schedule around her needs without discussion. He called in the middle of the day, not with work questions, but to ask how she was feeling. One morning he appeared at her office with coffee made exactly as she liked it, and she looked at him and said, "You've been paying attention. For longer than you know," he said simply. She said yes to him on a Tuesday evening, over dinner at his apartment, while he was in the middle of saying something else, because she'd been ready for a while and was done making him wait. He went quiet in the middle of his sentence. Then he got up from his side of the table and came around and kissed her in a way of someone who has been given something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. The ring he produced was not from a pocket or a prepared drawer. It was from his safe, and when he showed it to her, she understood that it had been there for some time. "It was Emily's," he said quietly. "And then, if you'd rather." Sarah looked at the ring. She looked at him. She put it on. He exhaled. "It means you're serious," she said. "I've been serious for a while," he said. "I was just slower than I should have been." They were married in the spring in a ceremony that was small and specific. The people who had actually been part of the story in a venue that didn't need to announce itself. Sarah wore white and carried flowers and walked toward him with the particular certainty of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply arriving at it. He cried. He was not apologetic about this. She cried too and was similarly unapologetic. The baby arrived in the autumn, in the way of someone who has decided on her timing and is not interested in other opinions. Sarah was at a meeting when her body provided irrefutable evidence that the meeting was over, and the subsequent journey to the hospital was conducted at a speed that the traffic laws of the city would have found objectionable. In the car, William held her hand and also gripped the steering wheel with a tension that suggested he was operating on two simultaneous emotional frequencies and could not reconcile them. "You're hyperventilating," Sarah observed between contractions. "I'm breathing rapidly." "There's a distinction. You're about to give birth. The hospital is 12 minutes away, and you're the one hyperventilating." He exhaled. Right. You're right." She squeezed his hand so hard during the next contraction that he made an involuntary sound. She was, under the circumstances, unrepentant. The delivery was long and produced, at the end of it, a sound that was the finest sound either of them had ever heard, and William stood by the bed with tears running unchecked down his face and did not attempt to manage this in any way. "A girl," the doctor confirmed, placing her in Sarah's arms. "I knew," said William, his voice entirely gone. "You always say that," said Sarah, looking down at their daughter. She was small and real and had arrived with opinions, expressed loudly, which they both found immediately, irrationally, entirely wonderful. He touched the baby's hand with one finger. The baby gripped it with the automatic trust of someone who has decided this person will do. "What do we call her?" Sarah asked. He looked at his daughter, then at his wife. "Clara," he said. "It means bright and clear and full of light." "Clara," Sarah said. "Clara Smith." William bent and pressed his lips to Sarah's forehead, then to Clara's. "Welcome to everything," he said quietly. "We've been waiting." The years afterward were lived at a pace that felt fast in the living and slow in the remembering. Clara was everything her father had been professionally, decisive, demanding, utterly certain about her own requirements, and everything her mother had been personally, which meant she approached life with the specific combination of humor and stubbornness that had originally resulted in a woman accidentally hiding in a CEO's bathroom stall and claiming to be a sanitary inspector. She walked early and talked earlier, and before long, she was conducting the household according to her own priorities, which William found endlessly surprising and Sarah found entirely predictable. "You're raising a small version of yourself," he said one evening, watching Clara issue instructions to the dog about where it was and was not permitted to sit. "She takes after both of us," Sarah said. "She has your determination. And your complete indifference to being told no," he said. "That's the determination," said Sarah. Their apartment, which had once been the meticulously organized space of a man who lived alone and kept it that way to reflect something about control, had been comprehensively reorganized by the addition of one small person with strong opinions about where things should go. William sometimes stood in the doorway of what had been his study and looked at the plastic kitchen set installed in the corner and the drawings on the wall and the general happy disorder of it all, and felt a kind of satisfaction he hadn't known existed before he'd know to look for it. He still ran his company with the precision that had built it, but he ran it differently. He was home for dinner more than he had been, and he took call from Sarah during the day just to hear how things were going, and when Clara was sick, he canceled meetings without the calculation he would once have applied to that decision. "It's not weakness," Sarah told him once when he raised this as something he was thinking about. "I know," he said. "It took me a while to believe it, but I know." Smith Enterprises continued to grow, and Sarah continued to translate, not just languages, but increasingly William himself to the people around him, who found him easier to work with than he had once been and were not always sure why. She had her own projects and her own professional identity, and he admired it with the specific pride of someone watching a person be fully themselves. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, William came home to find the apartment as Sarah had arranged it. Dinner made, Clara asleep, the particular quiet of an evening that had been prepared with care. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're staring. I'm allowed. You're my wife." She turned around and looked at him, and he was standing there in his coat with his briefcase still in his hand, and his eyes had the quality they got sometimes, the full, unguarded quality that had taken him years to allow himself. "Come in," she said. "It's going to get cold." He set down the briefcase. He took off his coat. He came to her in the kitchen and kissed her in the middle of everything, in the specific, unhurried way of a person who is not going anywhere. "5 years," he said, against her hair. "More than 5, she said. "We were a disaster for a while first." He laughed. "Yes, we were." She leaned back and looked at him. "Are you happy?" It was the question she had asked him very early, in a different context, and he had given her the professional answer. He had been learning, since then, to give the true one. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen around them, the drawings Clara had made taped to the refrigerator, the evidence of a life built rather than managed, the particular warmth of a place where someone had been loved carefully and at considerable personal cost, and had kept showing up anyway. "Yes," he said, "more than I ever knew was available to me." Sarah put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his own. In the next room, their daughter slept the heavy sleep of someone who had spent the day being entirely herself without apology, which was, both her parents had decided, the only way they intended to raise her. And the evening went on, ordinary and irreplaceable and precisely as real as the life they had built it from. One honest conversation at a time, one choice at a time, beginning, improbably and inevitably, on the morning a woman walked through the wrong door and refused to pretend she hadn't.